By 1660, there were 5 permanent professional theater companies in Paris, including Moliere's. The Opera, which was run by a man named Jean-Baptiste Lally. There was an Italian troupe that had set up a permanent shop there, and then 2 competing companies that performed comedies and tragedies. But by the time that Moliere had died in 1673, government and regulation had changed the way in which theaters operated and had compressed those companies down to just 3. So Moliere's company was the only company that held a legal permission to perform comedies and tragedies. And the name was changed. Moliere's company was combined with the 2 other competing companies into the Comédie Française, which became the national theater and is still the national theater of France. Then there was the Opera, which was allowed, which had the patent essentially to perform all sorts of musical and spectacle performances. And then the Italian troupe, which performed commedia dell'arte and what came to be known as comic operas. By the final 2 decades of the 17th century, less than 100 years since sort of the freewheeling days of actors in Paris, there were only 3 theater companies allowed in the city, and each had their specific purview from which they were not allowed to deviate. They had their traditions that they were expected to maintain, and they were not encouraged, not permitted to develop anything new. So the culture became extremely stultified. It became rigid and fixed. And as a consequence, in some ways, French theater suffered tremendously. Outside of Paris, there were other touring and performing troupes. Technically, a lot of these troupes were illegal, but they managed to scrape out a living nevertheless. But they were not able to achieve fame or really any quality of life because they were barred from entrance to the city of Paris. In the final few decades of the 17th century and first decades of the 18th century, neoclassical ideals were mutated. They were colored by a new movement called sentimentalism. So remember that Joseph Campbell understood, expressed Greek tragedy and Greek drama as an expression of the notion that the human and divine forces are at odds with one another, and that life is a condition of constant and unexpected change. And neoclassicism echoes this essential philosophic position. But sentimentalism was a more tender perspective. In his old age, Louis XIV became more conservative and more religious, and came to understand the world, came to understand human nature as essentially good, and that evil only emerged from corruption of that essential good. That there was no inherent conflict in the world. There was no inherent conflict in human nature. And this affected both comedies and tragedies, but it essentially demanded that human beings be depicted as doing good at all times throughout their lives. So Moliere's old vision of satire and of the need for social sanity is displaced here by an emotionalism, a tenderness, such that comedies and tragedies now are both causes to weep, and frequently to weep with joy. The rigid form that is enforced by the Academy is muddled in this period. We find this muddying, we see this softening in scenic design, for instance, which moves away from a single point of focus to a multi-point focus, which allows the actors to perform closer to the sets than they've ever been before, but also now makes it possible for multiple seats in the house to have a perfect perspectival view, and I think suggests philosophically that there are more than one perspective to any number of questions, or to the physical relationship to any object. But in the physical design of the theater, you see this philosophic move towards a softened and more gentle approach to the truth that manifests itself here at the turn of the century. In 1697, in the wake of a brazenly political performance, Louis XIV expelled the Commedia Italienne, the Italian company that performed the Commedia dell'arte, were exiled from the country, leaving only the opera and the Comédie Française as the two theater companies, the two legal theater companies permitted in Paris at this time. In combination with the muddying effect that sentimentalism was having on the neoclassical form, and the inability of the neoclassical form itself to evolve because it had been so conventionalized, French theater finds itself at a bit of a crisis, at a crossroads. It's choking. The French theatrical tradition is most strongly associated with this neoclassical period. And the French adapted, refined, and improved in many ways Italian principles and Italian design. And ultimately, the plays of the latter half of the 17th century in many ways exceeded the work of the Italian Renaissance artists, such that the French lay primary claim to the neoclassical tradition. The works of Racine and of Moliere have survived this period and have been hugely influential, particularly Moliere, in the world of comedy and of farce. And the establishment of the National French Theatre in 1680 of the Comédie Française would serve as a template for a relationship between government and the arts for the establishment of national theatres in a variety of countries that would develop hugely important work throughout Europe over the course of the next 150 years.